a risk for growth as central banks have highly accommodative rates and can put pressure on interest rates to rise both in emerging and advanced economies?
So oil prices have come back about 20% from their depths in 2020. But, given where we are right now at around $50, around that range, a barrel of oil, it's still well below the pre-crisis levels. With metal prices, indeed, those prices have come back and are above the pre-pandemic levels, and that's a reflection of the increase in demand that's coming from China, but also some supply-side bottlenecks. To your question of the implications of that for inflation, of course, that shows up in headline inflation and not as much in core inflation. And some of this should be transitory. So as of now, given the slack we see in the global economy in terms of employment, in terms of the decline in labor force participation rates, in the terms of hours worked being well below the pre-pandemic level, we don't see this as translating into runaway inflation or unanchored inflation expectations on the upside. Thank you.
A question on the divergence between the U.S. and the Eurozone. How do you explain the divergence between the U.S. and the Eurozone in 2021? Does it mean that the U.S. decision to have less restrictions and no lockdowns proves better for the economy? That's opinion in France.
There are multiple factors. Firstly, the particular kinds of public health responses in Europe led to more restrictions on activity. You had a much more severe pandemic that started a little early on in Europe relative to the US. Secondly, the structural composition of these economies matters a lot. So if you're a country that depends a lot on tourism, which several economies in Europe do, then again, the hit is much severe, and it's also more longer lasting because that can take longer to come back up. There are many more small and medium enterprises in Europe, and that is also that. And we know that in this crisis, they've been affected more than larger firms have been. So that's a third factor. So all of these go behind why we have this particular projected path of recoveries for the Europe and the euro area versus the US.
Thanks, Geeta. I'm going to move now to some more country-specific questions. So this one is from Phil Aldrich from The Times in the UK. The question is, the UK is the only G7 nation to be downgraded for 2020, and it's downgraded again in 2021. Why does the UK fare worse in these forecasts than other leading economies? Is it related to Brexit?
Well, in the case of the UK, you've had the second waves towards the end of last year, which had a negative effect on activity, and that offset what was otherwise a positive revision that we had for growth in the first 3 quarters of last year. And now there's a third wave with the new strain of the virus, which is leading to more prolonged restrictions in movement. And that's one of the reasons why we have the downgrade. For the impact of Brexit, we estimate would reduce the quarter-on-quarter in the first quarter of this year, then would have a negative hit of about 1% of GDP. Again, this is quarter-on-quarter for the first quarter of this year. And so these are some of the factors that have are behind this. But again, we have a revision up in going forward for 2022 when we should see growth coming back. It's kind of a lagged recovery that we have over here.
Thank you. Now moving on to Japan, a question from Nikkei. The Wheel suggested that Japan will be one of the key drivers for the economic growth in 2021. But Japan's growth rate would be 3.1% in 2021 and 2.4% in 2022. Those are lower than the US or the euro area. Do you have any other reason than Japan's low potential growth for that development?
I think the low potential growth is a very important part of the story. Japan has put on a lot of stimulus, including the additional stimulus at the end of the year. But let me actually bring in my colleague, Petya, if you would like to add something on Japan.
I think the actions that we have seen by the authorities, including not only on the fiscal front but also on the monetary front, have been very important in contributing to those upward revisions in the forecast.
Thanks very much, Petya. So I'm going to move now to a question on China from Xinhua. The question is, the Chinese economy is estimated to grow at 2.3% or in 2020, or is estimated to have grown at 2.3% in 2020, and it's projected to continue to recover this year with an expected growth of 8.1%. What are the key factors for China's robust recovery? And looking ahead, how does China recovery path look like?
So China has been very successful in containing the pandemic, and that has played a very important role to bring back activity much more quickly. There's been effective policy support provided both in terms of fiscal policy and monetary policy. And China's exports have also gone up in this environment. So all of these factors are responsible for China doing as well as it has. And indeed, like we said, it is one of these economies that's returning back to the pre-pandemic projected level in the fourth quarter of 2020, well ahead of other major economies. I'd like to see if my colleague Malhar would like to come in and add a few points.
Thanks, Gita. Yeah, just to reinforce the point that you raised on policy support, that's been a big driver of the impressive rebound in China in 2020. The public infrastructure spending support, and also the support that was extended to affected households and to firms, reinforced by aggressive actions by the People's Bank of China to provide liquidity support and ensure that credit provision remains strong. Going forward, we see a gradual handoff to private sector activity, starting out with a pickup in private investment activity, and that's in fact already been seen in the second half of last year, and we expect that to continue, but also increasingly shifting towards more private consumption-based growth. But in terms of securing that recovery path, it's vitally important to ensure that rebalancing towards private consumption continues and perhaps even is accelerated to an extent with efforts to strengthen the social safety net, which will help bring down precautionary savings among households in China, encourage them to spend more, and to rotate the composition of growth more towards private consumption. Reinforcing that with structural reform efforts to deregulate certain key sectors, to bring in more private investment in those sectors, for example, in services, would also help secure the medium-term growth path. But overall, as you mentioned, Gita, a very impressive recovery in 2020 after strong initial containment effort, reinforced by aggressive policy support.
Thanks, Malhar. And again, thanks to all the colleagues that have been sending their questions online, given our difficulties with WebEx. So here's a question now. We're staying in Asia, but now on India. Could you please explain your projection of 11.5% growth rate for India in 2021-2022, which is higher than other institutions like the UN and the World Bank? What are the conditions for it to continue?
So when we look at India numbers, of course, you have to cumulate over the last 2 years, so like 2020 and 2021. India is estimated to have had a contraction of around negative 8% for this 2021 fiscal year. And then we do have, as you said, a bounce back in growth to around 11%. But again, cumulatively, by the end of 2022, India is still 9% below its pre-pandemic projected level. So we are seeing India come back to its 2019 levels in 2021, but it's still below. Why do we have these upgrades? We have the upgrade one because activity and mobility particularly came back much faster than expected in India. We have not seen another wave. In fact, we are seeing a very strong decline in cases, which is, again, a bit different from other parts of the world. And so these factors, including what we're seeing in terms of high-frequency indicators, point to a somewhat faster pace of recovery. But again, there is still some distance to go.
Thanks, Gita. I'm going to switch regions here. There are a couple of questions on Latin America. I'm going to put them together here. One is from Efe. The question is, Latin America was one of the regions most affected by the pandemic and the economic crisis. Which countries will be recovering first? And is there a risk for another lost decade? And in the same vein, Rafael Matos from La Nación asks, can you please describe the risks for the recovery in Latin America, and specifically, how does the situation in Argentina impact the outlook for the region?
So indeed, Latin America was particularly hard hit by the pandemic. If you look at the number of cases per million, the number of deaths per million, it's been a pretty difficult time for Latin America. And for the region as a whole, we saw a severe contraction, but again, that was less severe than we had expected in October because of stronger recoveries when you saw when activity started coming back up, when countries were reopening from their lockdown. What we do have is very differing speeds of recoveries and also different levels of contraction that countries have. There are big differences between Brazil and Mexico. Many factors play a role, including the amount of policy support that was deployed, the amount of fiscal policy support that was provided. These are challenging times for Latin America. Now, to the extent that we see a return in growth in the global economy and including its main trading partners, including the US, we should see that having positive spillovers to the Latin America region. But until this pandemic is over, the risks remain very high. There are still a large number of cases in the area. There are new strains that are being found in different parts of the world. And we know vaccinations have rolled out, but I think in many parts of the world, the vaccinations are not just happening at a fast enough pace. So, these are important factors that make the outlook remain uncertain. Don't know if Petya would like to add anything on Latin America.
Just to add that across the region, we've also seen some countries being ahead of others in terms of securing vaccines and starting that process of vaccination. So here, countries such as Chile and Mexico and Costa Rica stand out. So again, going back to our recommendation on how to make this recovery appear and strengthen as much as possible, going that route in terms of the health response is the first order of business.
Thanks, Petya. Now, another question on the Americas, but this is on the US more specifically. The question comes from Delphine Toitou at AFP. And the question is, did you evaluate the potential impact of the rescue plan of $1.9 trillion unveiled by the new American President Joe Biden, both on the US growth and on global growth?
These are still early days. We have what I would describe as a very preliminary estimate at this point of the impact on the U.S. economy and not for the world at this point. For the U.S. economy, we have that this can raise output incomes or output in the U.S. by 5% over 3 years. That's what we have in terms of our estimate, including increasing growth this year by 1.25%. But again, just to be very clear, this is all still preliminary. Many things are still being worked out at this point, but this is what we have as a first estimate.
Thanks, Gita. Now, switching regions again and moving to Africa. This is a question, and I apologize, I don't have the journalist's name here. With the new variant of the virus now being found in some African countries, where hope for access of vaccine is still weak, will the IMF be stepping up to help these countries?
We are flagging this. This is a very important concern. One of the reasons we are having this diverging recoveries is because of the inequitous access to vaccines that we are seeing around the world. Now, there are advanced economies and some emerging and developing economies that are expected to get to widespread vaccine coverage in the second half of this year. But then there are many countries that are waiting until 2022 for that to happen. And that's just costly. It's costly for everybody. It's costly not just for developing countries, but it's very costly for the countries that have the vaccines too, which is why we are calling on greater funding for making sure these vaccines are available to poorer nations, also including the funding of logistics to make them delivered and to have actual vaccine uptake. This is a very important priority. Funding COVAX is very important. The fact that the U.S. has joined the WHO and is promising to provide money to COVAX, I think, is a very big step in that direction. But much more will be needed because, as we can see, given the mutating virus, that this is not a problem that's going away anytime soon.
Thanks, Geeta. So I'm told that we have managed to fix the issue with the WebEx. So if colleagues want to log on there, you're more than welcome to do so. In the meantime, I do have a question on another region. This is on the Middle East and North Africa. And the question is from Haram Online. What are the IMF expectations for MENA's economic outlook in 2021 and 2022? And how does the IMF see the debt crisis in the region in 2021? And which policies does it propose to manage in the region?
Again, in the case of MENA too, like many other regions in the world, there are different paces of recovery. What we've seen in general is, in terms of the impact on growth, it was more negative for oil exporting nations relative to the ones that are not. But again, we also found that the effect on oil exporters was not as negative as we might have we projected last time around, because in these economies like Saudi Arabia, for instance, we've seen non-oil activity return back much more strongly. Now, again, there's great differences. There are fragile states. There is, we have Lebanon, which has very high financing needs, and so, there are, and tourism isn't, cross-border tourism isn't returning anytime soon, which has implications for countries that rely on tourism. And so there are many different diverse paths of recovery here. And again, let me bring in Petya to add anything.
Thank you, Geeta. Just to add that, as in other regions, we do have that divergent path also because of access and actions taken on the vaccination front. And here is where countries such as those in the Gulf region have been ahead of others and securing somewhat diversified sources of vaccine. And so making sure that access to vaccine reaches everyone in the region is something very important going forward.
Thanks, Petya. I'm coming back now to Latin America. I have a question from El Economista in Mexico. The question is, in the update, the IMF has increased the GDP projections for Mexico in 2021. Can you please explain if that means that the economy is on a path for recovery? In case yes, what are the sectors that are going to be boosting that development?
What we're seeing in Mexico is a two-speed recovery. So what we're seeing is that the growth is coming from external demand with an increase in exports, while on the other hand, domestic demand remains subdued. And so that's playing out in the numbers. And of course, depending upon what happens in the U.S. this year in terms of additional support plans, that could be an upside risk for Mexico. But if you look at the cumulative effect between 2020 and 2021 on the recovery, you can see that this is still well below 2019 levels. and it will take some more time, at least until 2022 or later, to get back to the pre-COVID levels. So that's what we have for Mexico at this point.
Thank you, Geeta. I have a question here from Anthony Rowley from the South China Morning Post. Do you think that the impact of the supply chain interruptions to goods production, combined with the ongoing monetary stimulus, could create inflationary pressures?
Again, the answer depends upon the country we're talking about. But for many advanced economies, as we see it, there is still a fair amount of slack. Employment rates, labor force participation rates are still below their pre-pandemic level. We're still in the midst of the crisis. And inflation expectations are still well anchored. Again, there's a difference here between the US and the Euro area. Euro area, the concern is about inflation drifting too low. And in the US, we have, in terms of our predictions for core inflation, it still is slightly below or around the 2% target. So we don't expect to see a runaway inflation in these countries. And also, in terms of global supply chains and the effect that might have, if you look at the facts, merchandise trade has returned back to pre-pandemic levels, and this is much faster than during the global financial crisis. And so we don't really see a dramatic breakdown of global supply chains around the world as of now. I mean, trade is still weak in services, but in goods trade, we've seen a strong recovery.
Thanks very much, Geeta. I see that we don't have any additional questions here. And again, my apologies for the colleagues following us online for the hiccup with the WebEx. So I'm going to ask Geeta, Petya, and Mauhar if they have any closing words about the outlook and the policy priorities before we close the press conference.
Thank you, Rafael. I mean, just to reiterate what I said at the start, which is that we are living in highly uncertain times. We are projecting the world would grow this year as opposed to a severe collapse last year. But there is uncertainty. A lot depends upon the outcome of this race between a mutating virus and vaccines and how much policy support can hold up. And what we are seeing is divergence in prospects across countries. Emerging and developing nations are projected to have greater output losses relative to their pre-pandemic projected levels as compared to advanced economies. And this doesn't have to be this way. It can be arrested. It can be reversed. That would require more broad access to vaccines, and not just vaccinations, which is getting the logistics done too, and therapies to end this health crisis everywhere. It's important for countries that don't have the financial access that some other countries do, that they receive support from the international community in terms of concessional financing, in terms of grants, aids, in some cases outright debt restructuring. So there is still much to be done, but we're certainly at least in positive growth territory this year as opposed to last year.
With that, if there are no other comments, I'm going to close this press conference. Again, thanking our speakers for today, Geeta Gopinath, Petya Cueva-Brooks, Mauhar Nabar, and every one of you who has followed us online. And again, our apologies for the technical problems that we've experienced. Stay safe, stay well, and see you soon. Thank you.
All right, can you just go ahead and chat with them, Warren?
Hello, this is Warren Brown from the IMF Blue Level Studio, making sure anyone can hear me. Testing, testing. Currently not hearing anything back, but let's see. This is definitely turned up. Yes, it is. Testing, testing. Warren Brown speaking. 1, 2, 3. Talking into boom microphone. Testing, testing. Testing audio. Downstairs, IMF Studio, Washington, D.C. Testing. Oh, it's over Skype. Okay.
Oh, yeah. That was the plan. No, we found out. Oh yeah, we were ready to roll. Yeah, absolutely. I'll be able to chat a little bit more later. Okay, yeah. Anybody?
No one so far, no. Okay,
Nothing yet?
nothing so far.
Okay, should I send him an email?
Yeah, if you have a contact, that'd be